Let me read to you a passage from the 9th chapter of St. Luke's Gospel, verses 51 to 56. It's the Gospel for Tuesday of the 26th week in Ordinary Time. St. Luke writes, "As the time approached for him to be taken up to heaven, Jesus resolutely set out for Jerusalem. And he sent messengers on ahead, who went into a Samaritan village to get things ready for him. But the people there did not welcome him, because he was heading for Jerusalem. When the disciples James and John saw this, they asked, 'Lord, do you want us to call fire down from heaven to destroy them?' But Jesus turned and rebuked them. Then he and his disciples went to another village." That's from Luke chapter 9, verses 51 to 56. Let's just think of that request to bring fire down from heaven. You know, it's as plain as the day from the most cursory reading of the Gospels that Jesus Christ had extraordinary powers. In fact, there was nothing he could not do had he so chosen. He could calm storms at sea at a mere word. He could, at a mere word, drive out demons who had long held certain persons in their possession. He could liberate persons from any kind of illness or disease. He could even, at a mere word, raise a person from the dead. He could feed multitudes with a handful of food. And he was, on top of this, exceptionally great in personal holiness. He was magnificent in all respects. We would say, were some of these qualities found in another, that such a person had the world at his feet. And that is precisely what the devil offered him, if he would but acknowledge him, Satan, as supreme. But the next thing we notice is that our Lord refused to impose himself, which is to say, force himself and his wishes on anyone. He would not use his powers to compel recognition or assent to himself or his teaching. How different was this to the great ones of the world? Take any example: Alexander, Julius Caesar, Titus, Hadrian, Genghis Khan, whoever it may be. My suspicion is that Christ's enemies, the temple aristocracy and the highest echelons of the religious leadership, perceived this and were emboldened accordingly. Christ bore witness to the truth of himself and his teaching to the uttermost, even to death, but would not compel assent to this witness. He dealt respectfully with the choice of each person, even with those who wronged him profoundly. Consider his continuing restraint with respect to Judas Iscariot, whose heart had turned away from him so much as to evoke the description of him by Christ that he was a devil in John chapter 6 verse 70. Our Lord did not expose him and turn him out of his company in disgrace. In our Gospel today, from Luke chapter 9 verse 51 to 56, we read that our Lord, resolutely on his way to Jerusalem, was refused hospitality by a Samaritan village because he was heading towards Jerusalem. It was an affront which James and John felt, and they asked that they appeal to heaven for a judgment on the ungracious Samaritans. But this was entirely foreign to the ways of Jesus Christ. He respectfully, meekly turned from that village and took another direction, in all respectfulness. Our Lord's intent was to extend his kingdom across the face of the earth, indeed, that it embrace all the nations of the world. Just before he ascended into heaven, he charged his disciples to go to the whole world and make disciples of all the nations. Matthew chapter 28 verse 19. The nations were to enter his kingdom by baptism and were to obey all his commands. It was an ambition rarely held by any other. Did Alexander intend to conquer the whole world? Well, it's uncertain whether, after his conquest of Persia, he intended to direct his sights against Carthage in the west. Rome, after consolidating its empire, came to the point of establishing an outer limit. It had a wall across Britain, and it had a limit at the Germanic tribes. There was no such limit to the kingdom of Jesus Christ. It was a kingdom in this world, but not of this world. And it certainly did not employ the weapons of earthly kingdoms. Its method was to bear witness unto the cross, obedience to God unto death, and following in the footsteps of the Master himself. Its method of advance was not force, but loving and respectful witness. As with the Samaritans of our gospel passage today that I read, the disciples of Christ were not to impose Jesus Christ, but respectfully to propose him and his revelation. The witness was to be courageous, intrepid, undaunting, but never forced by threat of violence, which is what James and John, for love of their Master, were in effect requesting. As a matter of fact, the life of Christ reveals that this witness is at its most effective when given under conditions of persecution. Christ returned to Jerusalem to bear witness, knowing that it meant death, and knowing that this witness unto death would redeem the world, would lead to his entry into glory, to the sending of the Spirit, and to the advance of his kingdom. Christ's path would be the path of the church for nearly 3 centuries. It would be 3 centuries of witness amid persecution and death, and the empire would be conquered, not by imposing, but by proposing. The event portrayed in the gospel I read earlier is iconic of what was to come. There is rejection, and the disciple of Jesus Christ responds with love and respect, and with that his witness has fruitful effect. As the Master acts, so does the disciple. If we wish our lives to bear much fruit, then the path to follow is that followed by Jesus Christ, and followed for love of him. This is the meaning of our Lord's great sayings. For instance, that if someone strikes you on the cheek, turn to him the other as well. They mean that evil is to be answered by good, hate by love, lies by the truth. That is the method of bringing Christ to our neighbour, and it is encapsulated in the gospel passage I read earlier, the incident with the Samaritans. Let us take Christ's message to heart then, and spread it abroad in the way he himself spread it